So this is part 2 of my commentary on Phaedo, the Platonic dialogue. So we are at a place that Socrates is imprisoned. He has been convicted of corrupting the city youth and of not believing in the gods of the state, creating and believing in his own gods. And so now he is in prison, awaiting death, waiting to be executed. And he's having a conversation with his friends that has to do with the nature of the soul. Now his friends believe that what he is doing by not taking their hand to escape to some other land is false. Socrates believes that what he is doing, remaining in prison and awaiting to die for the sins that the state says that he has committed, Socrates does not believe their decision to be right, I guess from a moral standpoint, but his duty to his state I think binds him to the conviction. And he says it's better to die an honest man than to die somebody that had told a falsehood to the jury, to betray his responsibility to the state, to essentially spit in the face of his forebears and the very structure that binds that society together. His friends also believe that what he is doing is close to or approaching suicide, and that he is choosing to die because he has the choice to liberate himself from death. Again, a similar sort of rebuttal here. But our conversation now is about the nature of the soul, what happens to it after death. We've heard so far Socrates' argument. His argument is that the soul continues after death. It existed before death. And here we see the point at which I think gets into the heart of Socrates' conviction, because he is pointing at perhaps not necessarily just the continuation of the soul and also the existence of the soul beforehand, but the fact that the soul is something that has come from a source, a single source. And we have the hints of this from the discussion earlier on about that of recollection, that of this knowledge and understanding that man learns throughout his life. He makes the argument this is something that is possibly known to him and at a later point forgotten, or something that exists to be known, something that exists for man to perceive, that it's unique to man because of his ability to perceive, because of his conscious mind, because of his faculties. Now the interesting thing is, now there are many things that I'm skipping over here, that if one is curious that you can go to the first episode, but the place that we are at now is we've just finished hearing a purely material argument for the soul. That is, the soul exists only with its attachment to the body, and that when the body dies, the soul dies. We are now into a new argument, This argument is a little bit less material, but it is still finite. The argument is not for the immortality of the soul, but we have this illustration. The illustration depicts an old weaver. This old weaver, he wears many cloaks in his lifetime. And just as the man wears many cloaks in his lifetime, but eventually dies at some point with his remaining cloak, it illustrates the passing of this material cycle of something reducing itself into a state of disuse, something of meaning to something of non-meaning, I guess you could say, something that does not meet the purpose that it was designed for. And so therefore the weaver makes a new cloak to wear, thereby completing the cycle of being, which is something that Socrates brought about. So we're dealing with the fundamental principle that Socrates introduced, this hypothesis of opposites, that what comes from, let's say, death, or in this case it's more of a material thing, so non-utility, we can say, to something that is useful, not non-cloak to cloak, or immaterial to material. This cycle of becoming, occurs multiple times throughout this man's life. Now, the argument here by Siebes is that when the man dies, this process of making cloaks no longer continues, because the man is no longer alive in the material sense to continue that cycle. He extends the argument to say, well, the soul must be in a similar sort of thing. Now we're making a big leap here because we're not going back into the discussion of the nature of the soul, which we discussed in the first episode. But I will say that Siebes' argument extends to the point of the soul that there are many men, there are many bodies by which the soul can inhabit. But at a certain point, just like the weaver, at a certain point perishes, his body perishes, and he can no longer produce new cloaks, the soul can no longer inhabit new bodies. It dissipates. And so it's interesting, this idea that there are many material cycles of coming into being in a more intelligible sense to man, making a cloak from raw material that are otherwise not all that useful to us. This process placed on a finite timeline, that bound by the existence of the body, again another material cycle. Then we get into the immaterial realm in which the soul transcends that cycle. It is more of an elevated thing, and it begins its own cycle into the non-corporeal. Now, I would argue this is not something that Siebes got into, but using his logic and saying that, okay, time continues, and at the spiritual level, we have the continuation of the soul through the material world, that they're inhabiting the bodies. We have this through a number of generations, let's say, and then the soul dies or dissipates. But just as the soul can reinvigorate a body, and this reinvigoration of the body can reinvigorate the cycle of new cloak making, I think that the soul feeds back into the source of all intelligibility. the source of all being, let's say. And so that what comes from this source of being after the argument of Siebes that the soul dissipates at a certain point is that I don't necessarily want to say a new soul is created, but being continues to exist because it is infinite. And just because the cycle has ended does not mean that being has ended, because being itself is infinite. There is a source of it. Now, if there was not a source of it, then this would be all trending towards death. This would be all trending towards the finite, not the absolute. And so you can see, I think, here that I think there's a bit of Socrates. Socrates may agree with this, he may not, but you can see, I think, that this is trending towards something more unifying than the traditions and the culture at the time in Greece. Instead of more of a multiplicitous view of the divine, Socrates, I think, has a more central view of the divine. It is a layer above what the traditional people are used to seeing the world as. So let's continue with the conversation here. Now, it has been a number of days since I have recorded, and much of what I have to say now is going to be from memory and a few scattered notes. So from what I remember where we left off, we were talking about Simmias and Siebes' counter-argument to Socrates that the soul is immortal, both of whom believe in the finite nature of the soul, and accordingly, given the finite nature of the soul, Socrates should be convinced to leave his present condition, not submit himself to die at the hands of the state. Socrates, on the other hand, believes in the immortality of the soul. He believes that he will continue on in Hades. He will have some form of existence after his material existence. That's not to say that entirely his friends do not believe that there is some form of life after death, but certainly it is not in the immortal sense of the soul. So Socrates brings up this idea of the good and the wicked, whereas the most wicked and the most good often find themselves at the tail of the distribution of all people, and that most people lie somewhere in between. Well, it's that some people have good and evil within them, but the relative population for the extremes is quite small. And so we return to this idea about the continuation of the soul after death. If we recall, we arrived at a hypothesis about information coming into material existence, and through the mechanism of the human mind, we recall this information from some source, right? The information had some inception that gave birth to it. Now, what exactly this means for the soul, we are continuing to discuss, but at the very minimum, our argument continues with this idea, again, that the information has come down into this central point, and the central point is the pathway between this non-corporeal existence to the corporeal. It inhabits material form. It inhabits man. And we continue with a discussion of harmony. Now, harmony is an agreement between different elements. It's a unity. It is a coming together. We make the argument, Socrates makes the argument, that the harmony is not a composite. It is one in and of itself. So we can say that if something is less good, then we could say it's less harmonious. We could say something is more good, thereby being more harmonious. But this isn't quite satisfying. For the sake of the harmony, is a unity in and of itself. So it is either a harmony or it is not. And so thinking of things in terms of more of a harmony or less of a harmony doesn't really make sense. Either it is or is not. And we are talking about here the soul being a harmony. And there is mention to those that are burdened, let's say, by their constituent elements, we can say. This is, again, an argument that Socrates would not agree with, but the case that the desires, the base desires, the thirst, the hunger, the sexual desire, the desire for rest, escape, the desire that brings one away from the truth and from reality, and the finer things, the reason, the love, the logic, our experience, all of these things must exist together in a particular way for a harmony to exist. And if they do not come to a centralized point, they are disharmonious. And in this sense, the soul, in the state of disharmony, is not much of a soul. It is one of these situations in which we can find the soul bound to the earth, perhaps temporary in its existence. Again, Socrates would not agree with this. Our question is the soul a harmony, or is it a director of various elements? Is the soul immortal, or is it finite? Now this brings about a discussion of the exploration of the causes of things. Socrates makes the assertion that natural science of causation clouded his vision, for it did not include mind within its explanation. Now he gives the argument about the addition and about the division of something into two. In both cases, you could have something that is two, which can be considered a group, which is a unity, seen as one, but expressed as two. In this way, you have one object and another object coming together to form this group. In another, you have this disunity that is also two, the division of one into two separate objects. And yet we both call these things two. Now, their cause for their two-ness may be different, but they share in their two-ness. Part of this has to do with the perspective. In the case of the addition between one adding to another, we have the perspective of the one. And from this perspective of the one, we can see that when another one comes into its realm, I guess you could say, in its sphere of existence, the perspective is now larger and more encompassing. It includes both individuals to become this group, this two. Together they are two. Now in the reverse example, you have the perspective of one, but this perspective begins with the two. Even though the perspective begins with the two, they are considered one perspective. Now we end up dividing them into two separate perspectives. Now the conclusion here is that mind directs, and is the cause of everything. But is that really true? Is the mind the director of all? I think we could say no. What is the cause of each thing? Why does it come to be? Again, Socrates, being afflicted by the lack of mind in the investigation of the cause of things, he begins to think about causal reality. If the thing that there must be something that is changed for a cause to exist, for some result to occur. And so if we have some source, let's say if we talk about the beautiful, often in our culture we say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Is this true? In some sense, yes. But totally no. The beautiful is a source in and of itself. It can be perceived by the eye of man, by the direction of his gaze. But the perceptibility of beauty is from beauty itself. During a thunderstorm, one man may say that this is beautiful. It is a beautiful thing to witness. Another man may say that this is a frightful thing to witness, and beauty does not resonate. Now, it doesn't mean that this thunderstorm is not beautiful. It doesn't mean that it is inherently frightful. Well, we can say that the thunderstorm is not equivalent to the source of beauty. It is not beauty as it is in its finest sense, but it contains elements of that beauty. It contains those elements through man's perception, of the non-corporeal. Now the beautiful, the capital B beautiful, this source of beauty, and all such fine categories, represent the cause of seeing. Now I think this is an important distinction. It is not the cause of the thunderstorm, nor is the cause of the thunderstorm the cause of beauty. It is because of beauty that produces the cause of sight. And we can say, okay, well, there are mechanical factors, there are causal factors within the structure and the material object of the eye that results in seeing. That has nothing to do with this beauty. But again, this gets lost in the causal investigation of things. This is not the concern of man, in some sense. In some sense it is. It's because it's important to understand. But in another sense, we can only get so far with it. Because man ultimately exists within his own reality. He cannot stay above it and view it from above forever. Eventually he must participate in it. And so his participation through his conscious mind, through the perception of the non-corporeal that is this beautiful, it is the cause of his seeing it. And I would like to read an excerpt that I think is particularly interesting. Now this is Socrates speaking. This is his, I guess, his rebuttal to Cebes, but also more of a personal commentary on his path to wisdom and to knowledge. He says, "This wonderful hope was dashed." And here, this hope, he was referring to the pursuit of the causal explanation of things. "This wonderful hope was dashed, as I went on reading, and saw that man made no use of mind, nor gave it any responsibility for the management of things, but mentioned as causes air and ether and water and many other strange things. That seemed to me much like saying that Socrates' actions are all due to his mind, and then in trying to tell the cause of everything I do, to say that the reason that I am sitting here is because my body consists of bones and sinews, because the bones are hard and are separated by joints, that the sinews are such as to contract and relax, that they surround the bones along with flesh and skin which hold them together. Then as the bones are hanging in their sockets, the relaxation and contraction of the sinews enabled me to bend my limbs, and that is the cause of my sitting here with my limbs bent. Again, he would mention other such causes for my talking to you, sounds and air and hearing, and 1,000 other such things, but he would neglect to mention the true causes, that, after the Athenians decided it was better to condemn me. For this reason it seemed best to me to sit here, and more right to remain and to endure whatever penalty they ordered. For by the dog, I think these sinews and bones could long ago have been in Megara, or among the Boeotians, taken there by my belief as to the best course, if I had not thought it more right and honorable to endure whatever penalty the city ordered rather than escape and run away. To call those things causes is too absurd. If someone said that without bones and sinews and all such things, I should not be able to do what I decided, he would be right. But surely to say that they are the causes of what I do, and not that I have chosen the best course, even though I act with my mind, is to speak very lazily and carelessly." And so this is, in a nutshell, of the predicament of mind and the limitations of the exploration into the causal nature of things. He continues, "Imagine not being able to distinguish the real cause from that without the cause would not be able to act as a cause. It is what the majority appear to do, like people groping in the dark. They call it a cause, thus giving it a name that does not belong to it. That is why one man surrounds the earth with a vortex, to make the heavens, keep it in place. Another makes the air support it, like a wide lid. As for their capacity of being in the best place they could possibly be put, this they do not look for, nor do they believe it to have any divine force, but they believe that they will sometime discover a stronger and more immortal Atlas, to hold everything together more, and they do not believe that the truly good and binding binds and holds them together. I would gladly become the disciple of any man who taught the workings of that kind of cause. However, since I was deprived, I could neither discover it myself nor learn it from another. Do you wish me to give you an explanation of how, as a second best, I busied myself with the search for the cause? Cebes. And there he continues. And so I think this exploration is a fundamental pursuit. It is so close to the vision, let's say, of the mind, that it's almost imperceptible, because it is so close that we can't make out what it is. It's so fundamental, the lens through which we view our reality, our beliefs. Now, this exploration is certainly a dizzying pursuit, and Socrates himself states that after this he said, "When I had wearied of investigating things, I thought that I must be careful to avoid the experience of those who watch an eclipse of the sun, for some of them ruin their eyes unless they watch its eclipse, watch its reflection in water, or some such material." A similar thought crossed my mind, and I feared that my soul would be altogether blinded if I looked at things with my eyes and tried to grasp them with each of my senses. So I thought I must take refuge in discussions and investigate the truth of things by means of words. However, perhaps this analogy is inadequate, for I certainly do not admit that one who investigates things by means of words is dealing with images any more than one who looks at facts. However, I started in this manner, taking as my hypothesis in each case the theory that seemed to me to be most compelling. I would consider as true about cause and everything else, whatever agreed with this, and as untrue whatever did not so agree. But I want to put my meaning more clearly, for I do not think that you now understand me. And it's at this point we arrive at the discussion of the capital B beautiful and the capital G good. And so just as with the conversation about the good and the evil, the beautiful and the ugly, so too we can have the same conversation about tallness and shortness and hot and cold. And the main argument here by Socrates is that while we maintain our hypothesis of opposites that they put forth earlier, that the opposite of what is exists because it is in opposition to that thing. It is not the case that that thing is its opposite. It is as it is. It is as a form of something, just as the hot is the hot because it is hot. Now its opposite is the cold. It is the reflection of this hot. The molecular motion in the case of the cold is much slower than that of the hot. Average molecular motion is much higher. And so we have these terms relative to a certain degree, but at its extremes, as we talked about, the purely wicked and the purely good, or the mostly good and the mostly wicked, these are small populations, just as with the purely hot and the purely cold. But as we get out into the tails, we can imagine at some point we reach the extreme of one, that is the absolute hot and the absolute cold, the form itself. Now what I'm thinking has to do with, we can say a material causation for the form. We could say that what makes something hotter is speeding up its molecular motion. But what is hot itself in our reality seems to be relative to what is cold. But in the absolute sense, in the sense of mind, we can imagine the case at which the form of hotness itself is as itself. Now Socrates says, "It is true then about some of these things, that not only the form itself deserves its own name for all time," an example that we just used, the hot and the cold, "but there is something else that is not the form, but has its character whenever it exists. Perhaps I can make my meaning clearer. The odd must always be given this name we now mention. Is that not so?" And they reply, "Certainly." And so we can think of the odd as half of all numbers. We can think of the odd as, in the written form, the capital O odd, and then the small o odd. The small o odd would refer to something like the number 3. The 3 is not the same as the big O odd, because the number 3 does not encapsulate all odd numbers. It just encapsulates itself and its oddness. So from the capital O odd, all of the numbers and their individual traits and characteristics flow from it. Now there may be other traits, other things about the existence of the number 3, let's say, that flow from other sources, from other forms. We can think of the nature of 3. We already talked about division and addition, and what that has to do with oneness and two-ness. And so threeness would also be wrapped up in what it means to be 3. So we'll return to the discussion of 3 in a moment. This marks the separation of a day from one day to another. It's a strange thing, the sacrifices that we make. It's a strange thing to commit the mind to something beyond itself in one sense, below itself in another, and then for which it has no control over. The individual has control over finite ends anyway. But just to reflect on our sacrifices, many people are involved in these sacrifices, day in and day out. They look forward to nothing more than a rest, and once they find that rest, it's again back to the races. This temporary, fleeting thing. It makes existence feel like a chore. It makes existence feel like I want to say job, but certainly there are ways of being in which one's work is one's passion, that is one's life. We are sold many false promises. We are sold an idea, a vision. We are sold a vision about the place that we inhabit together. And I was wonder, through the changing of time, and the march of the institutions, the march of man, perhaps not in the forward direction, perhaps not in any direction, just marching in place, not going anywhere. I think about what we are a part of. I think about what the individual is a part of, and then I think about what the collective is a part of. It seems as though we are all parts of something, all pieces of a greater whole. Socrates says, "It is the only one of existing things to be called odd." This is my question. Or is there something else than the odd, which one must nevertheless also always call odd, as well as by its own name? Because it is such by nature as never to be separated from the capital O odd. I mean, for example, the number 3 and many others. Consider 3. Do you not think that it must always be called both by its own name and by that of the odd, which is not always the same as 3? That is the nature of 3, and of 5, and of half of all numbers. Each of them is odd, but it is not the capital O odd. Then again, 2 and 4, and the whole other column of numbers, each of them, while not being the same as the even, is always even. Do you not agree? Here we have a similar pattern. The capital O odd encompasses many numbers. The number 3, it goes by a distinct individual name, but it's a part of, and is, the small o odd, but it is not the big O odd. It is a part of that big O odd. Now exactly where I was going in the beginning, by saying that we're all sort of a part of something, that we work ourselves into the ground for what purpose? There seems to be no reason in it. Yet we are ordered in such a way as the 3 is ordered to the small o odd, as it is ordered to the big O odd. And regardless of the way that we use ourselves, we remain in this condition. The mind of man can go through many different changes, both on the individual level and the collective, the generational. But the mind is such a powerful thing. It's such a window, a mirror, a reflection into the state of the finer things. And yet what brings shame, what brings the unfortunate nature, is this: when this mind is unable to see, it's unable to express, when it's left imprisoned and chained. There's something that is always above itself in some sense, but the thing that is above itself is directed for poor purposes. thing above it is not directly in line with the thing below it. Sort of a disjointed, poorly segmented structure. Look now, what I want to make clear is this: not only do those opposites not admit each other, but this is also true of those things which, while not being opposite to each other, yet always contain the opposites. And it seems that these do not admit that form which is opposite to that which is in them. When it approaches them, they either perish or give way. Shall we say that 3 will perish or undergo anything before, while remaining 3 becoming even? So what does this mean? Not only do those opposites not admit each other, but that it is also true of those things which, while not being opposites to each other, yet always contain the opposites. So what does it mean for an opposite not to admit another? So we can take the example of the big and the small. For the big to exist, it cannot be its opposite. Because what would the big be if it is small? It's a contradiction in terms. The two, although may exist in some sense because of one another, they cannot be one another. Now when this opposite approaches them, they either perish or give way. So what then in this case, in the case of the things that I have mentioned, of the many uncertain things about life and about commitment to a particular occupation, or a commitment to a particular company, a commitment to a particular person, what can we say about the influence of good and its opposite of evil in this situation? What exactly does it mean for the good to perish to the evil, or the evil to perish to the good? Certainly, the evil cannot be the good, and the good cannot be the evil. But if there is good, there is evil. If there is the tall, there is the small. If there is the infinite, there is the finite. Perhaps this is not the best analogy to use, I'm not sure. It is then not only opposite forms that do not admit each other's approach, but also some other things that do not admit the onset of opposites. So what would it mean? Certainly we can understand that it is then not only opposites or opposite forms that do not admit each other's approach, because we've already said that if good is to approach evil, and its opposite is to admit evil into it, then it becomes what is admitted into it. It is no longer the thing that does the admitting. But what of these other things that do not admit the onset of opposites? We should define what they are. Would they be the things that compel whatever they occupy? not only to contain their form, but also always that of some opposite? As we were saying just now, you surely know that what the form of 3 occupies must not only be 3, but also odd. And we say that the opposite forms to the form that achieves this result could never come to it. Now, is it oddness that has done this? And opposite to this is the form of the even? Of course, the answer is yes. So then the form of the even will never come to 3. Never. Then 3 has no share in the even. Never. So 3 is uneven. Yes. As for what I said, we must define, that is, what kind of things, while not being opposites to something, yet do not admit the opposite. As for example, the triad. Though it is not the opposite of the even, yet does not admit it, because it always brings along the opposite of the even. And so the dyad in relation to the odd, fire to the cold, and very many other things, see whether you would define it thus. Not only does the opposite not admit its opposite, but that which brings along some opposite into that which it occupies. That which brings this along will not admit the opposite to that which it brings along. Refresh your memory. It is no worse for being heard often. 5 does not admit the form of the even, nor will 10, its double, admit the form of the odd. The double itself is an opposite of something else, yet it will not admit the form of the odd. Nor do 1 1/2 and other such fractions admit the form of the whole, nor will 1/3, and so on, if you follow me and agree to this. So the question is, what the hell is Socrates talking about here? So I'll try my best to synthesize this information. So let's start with the number 3. I think we all understand that the number 3, at least at this point, the number 3 has its own form. If we consider the object of our attention to be number 3, it has its own form. But it is also influenced by separate categories. One of those categories happens to be the category of the odd, the capital O odd, of the principle of the odd, the thing about the odd that encapsulates all odd numbers. Now, the thing that the 3, the form of the 3 occupies, which could be any number of different categories, let's say the odd, for example, it carries this oddness with it, because the oddness is a characteristic of the number 3. Now, because of this relationship to oddness, because of its character, it is not allowed to admit its opposite, which would be the even. But the even also contains any even number, let's say 2. So it cannot admit 2, even though 2 is not the opposite of 3, but it cannot admit it because it is encapsulated or occupied within the concept of evenness. And again, we can get lost in language here, but we have to remember that if 3, or we could just say, for simplicity's sake, if oddness was to be overrun or invaded by, whatever word you want to use, by the principle of the even, then the oddness would be destroyed. Because you cannot have an opposite that exists within itself. It's a contradiction. Now, the interesting thing here, if you think about it, we haven't gotten to this place yet in terms of the reading, but it's an interesting thought to follow. We will see if it occurs next in the dialogue. But if you take 3, you place it within the odd. You take the number 2, you place it in the form of the even, as an example of what the even would be. Sort of a loose relationship. Perhaps loose is not the right word. It is a relationship. A binding, we can say. But both the number 3, the number 4, or the number 2, any even number, is encapsulated in a larger form that we can call number. And same with the idea that Socrates puts forth about the half, or the fraction, and the whole. And we could say the whole would be number 1 because it's a whole number. But still, yet the fraction and the whole number are encapsulated by number. And so we have all of these forms that are floating about. Now these forms, like the oddness, or the form of the 3, or the form of the 2, they have relationships to one another. Now certain relationships are antagonistic to others. It prevents them from being together. Like, let's say, the 3 can be together with the odd, or the 2 can be together with the even. But there are categories that are above them all that bind them all together. And an example of that is number. I certainly agree, he said, and I follow you. Tell me again from the beginning, he said, and do not answer in the words of the question, but do as I do. I say that beyond that safe answer, which I spoke of first, I see another safe answer. If you should ask me what, coming into a body, makes it hot, my reply would not be that safe and ignorant one, that it is heat. But our present argument provides a more sophisticated answer, namely, fire. And if you ask me what, on coming into a body, makes it sick, I will not say sickness, but fever. Nor if I ask the presence of what in a number makes it odd, I will not say oddness, but oneness. And so with other things. See if you now sufficiently understand what I want. Quite sufficiently, he says. Answer me then, he said. What is it that, present in a body, makes it living? And the answer to that is a soul. So before we move forward, what exactly does this mean? Now we're getting into the weeds a bit here. It's a bit more and more difficult to discern what they're talking about. But if we're going to return to the example for a moment of the odd and its relationship to the 3, just because we've discussed it, I think this is a good jump-off point for the next example, which is the example of the body and of sickness, or of the body and heat. So beginning with the number 3, my thoughts are as follows. The 3 is a form in and of itself. It can be encapsulated by larger forms, or it can have relationships with larger forms that include 3, but also other objects, other numbers. And it can be placed within the context of what the number is itself. So it includes all of that information. It includes the odd with it. Now, if we are to ask ourselves what is the relationship of the 3 to the odd, we can say that, well, it's not divisible by 2. That would satisfy 3's relationship to the odd, but it would not satisfy the form of the odd, because the form of the odd is not just that it is not divisible by 2 in terms of its relationship to 3, but it is all numbers that are not divisible by 2. That is the form of the odd. And just like we can say there are certain characteristics of the 3 that would not fulfill the form of the odd. Like, part of 3's nature is that there are 3 components to it. But not every component of the odd, we can say, has 3 parts to it. So there is this relationship that is constant here. And this relationship, I think, is similar to that of this relationship or the process of becoming, when Socrates put forth his hypothesis of opposites. Now, we may get there at some point, but for now, we should talk about what he means by the example of the body and of sickness. Because the body in and of itself is a form, sickness in and of itself is a form. Now, we can ask ourselves, what is the relationship between the body and sickness? Well, the relationship and the thing that they both share would be that of the fever. But there are things that are not characteristic of the body that the sickness has, like all possible diseases. And likewise, not all sicknesses, or illnesses we can say, produce fever within the body. So perhaps it's not the best example on the part of Socrates, or I'm misinterpreting something. But if we are to discuss the other example that was given, which is, again, the question is, if you should ask me, what coming into a body makes it hot, my reply would not be that safe and ignorant one that it is heat, but our present argument provides a more sophisticated answer, namely fire. Now this is an interesting one, because my mind gets lost in semantics. But we have to assume that this is not purely a semantic thing, that there is some reason to this, and that he is saying particular words in a particular way for a particular reason. So if we consider the body, and we consider what is hot, we can say that there are things about the body that are characteristically opposed or separate from the hot, but they can share in a relationship. And this relationship is bound not necessarily by heat, which would be perhaps a superficial characteristic of the hot. Or heat is something that is more encompassing. But it's interesting that he uses fire. Now, fire has a particular symbolic significance, and it's another example that might sort of be lost in translation. But nevertheless, I think if we reflect on the categorization, I think we can see that there is a pattern within this mode of thought, and that there is particular meaning attributed to particular words, and these particular words have sort of a hierarchy of value. Whereas sickness is seen to be something that is above fever. Now it is above fever because it is, in this particular context, it shares the fever serves to unite the form of the sickness and the form of the body. Now the question is, well, why do we not reverse that? Why do we not say, well, what makes the body have a fever? Could we not say that it is sickness that unites them? And perhaps we cannot say that because the fever is a part of the sickness. It is a characteristic of the sickness. And so we see this inherent hierarchy of value in terms of language. So it cannot be purely semantic. We could say that it is semantic, that we could be right in saying so to a certain extent. But if we say that, and if we convince ourselves that we are correct in saying so, then we ignore this way of seeing language, this hierarchy of value. This hierarchy of value that provides us with a sense of the ability to unify different forms together, which I think is an integral part of language. So the question is then, what is it that present in a body makes it living? So, in my interpretation, if we are to follow the schematic that we have laid out here, the body has to have some relationship. The body in this case is a form. So it has to have some relationship to another form, and it has to be united by some word that has some meaning. Now, from my interpretation so far, this unified thing, the unified word, would be living. Now, the answer to the question is the soul. So then the question is, well, is the soul's relationship to the body the thing that causes it to live? Now, this may or may not be the case, but the answer is that a soul is the thing, at least the answer by Siebes, is that the soul is the thing that makes the body living. And is that always so? The answer, of course. Whatever the soul occupies, it always brings life to it. It does. Is there, or is there not, an opposite to life? There is. What is it? Death. So the soul will never admit the opposite of that which it brings along, as we agreed from what has been said. Most certainly, said Siebes. Well, and what do we call that which does not admit the form of the even, the uneven? What do we call that which will not admit the just, and that which will not admit the musical, the unmusical, or the unjust? Very well. What do we call that which does not admit death? The deathless. He said. Now the soul does not admit death. No, it does not. So the soul is deathless. It is. Very well, he said. Shall we say that this has been proved, do you think? Quite adequately proved, Socrates. Well now, Siebes, he said, if the uneven were of necessity indestructible, surely 3 would be indestructible. Of course. And if the non-hot were of necessity indestructible, then whenever anyone brought heat to snow, the snow would retreat safe and unthawed, for it could not be destroyed, nor again could it stand its ground and admit the heat. What you say is true. In the same way, if the non-cold were indestructible, then when some cold attacked the fire, it would neither be quenched nor destroyed, but retreat safely. Necessarily. Must then the same not be said of the deathless, if the deathless is also indestructible? It is impossible for the soul to be destroyed when death comes upon it, for it follows from what has been said that it will not admit death or be dead, just as 3, we said, will not be even, nor will the odd, nor will fire be cold, nor the heat that is in the fire. But, someone might say, what prevents the odd while not becoming even, as has been agreed, from being destroyed, and the even to come to be instead? We could not maintain against the man who said this, that it is not destroyed, for the uneven is not indestructible. If we had agreed that it was indestructible, we could easily have maintained that at the coming of even, the odd and the 3 have gone away and the same would hold for the fire and the hot and the other things. Surely. And so now, if we are agreed that the deathless is indestructible, the soul, besides being deathless, is indestructible. If not, we need another argument. So let's walk through this. If the deathless is also indestructible, it is impossible for the soul to be destroyed when death comes upon it. That follows logically. For it follows what has been said, that will not admit death, that it will not admit death or be dead, just as 3, we said, will not be even, nor will the odd, nor will fire be cold, nor the heat that is in the fire. Now this is because if a form is to occupy another, it would be a contradiction. It would falsify itself. The even cannot be its opposite. It can have an opposite, but it cannot be its opposite. If we had agreed that it was indestructible, we could easily have maintained that at the coming of the even, the odd and the 3 have gone away, and the same would hold for fire and the hot and other things. And so the question is, well, what does it mean for these things to have gone away? Where have they gone? In what way have they gone? And I think specifically when we're referring to more material examples that we can readily see in our environment. Now we can objectify the principle here of the 3 by taking 3 objects. Now what can we do to represent the odd itself? Well, there's nothing really that we can do except for to say that these 3 objects, when together in this group, are odd. They have the form. This form partially is coupled with it because it is within the character of the 3. Now the even cannot come in to this relationship unless it breaks the bonds of the 3. And if it breaks the bonds of the 3, then in that sense the odd goes away. Now the going away, I think of like physically, something is leaving. It's an interesting way to describe it. It's an interesting way to use language, perhaps. The principle is moving farther away from the object, we could say. And as the principle moves away from the object, it leaves it open for another form to inhabit it. It doesn't mean that the principle has been destroyed, because it's sort of an eternal thing, the concept of the odd and the concept of the even. It has gone away in the sense that it has no longer maintained the relationship that it once held with the object. And now the object has a fundamentally different relationship. It has a fundamentally different character. It is in union with fundamentally different forms, opposite forms. And so therefore, the odd cannot exist within this new structure. Now what follows is, I suppose, an interesting statement. Interesting series of statements. There is no need for one as far as that goes. Referring to needing another argument. If the deathless is indestructible, or if it is destructible, I should say. For hardly anything could resist destruction if the deathless, which lasts forever, would admit destruction. Again, this is the same thing. The opposite cannot be with its opposite. All would agree, said Socrates, that the God, interesting that he uses the singular, and the form, capital F, of life itself, and anything that is deathless, are never destroyed. All men would agree, by Zeus, to that, and the gods, I imagine, even more so. Interesting, in the second mention of the divine is a plural, and the first is the singular, and the second is the plural, seemingly to indicate that there is a unity among this divine realm and the divine entities. Or as to say that there's a belief on the part of Socrates that this is the case. So now the body is this physical object that has a relationship to the form of the finite, that of death, and has a relationship to the form of the soul, which is infinite. It is deathless. And so just as number can be even or odd, so too can the body live and die. Now the analogy is certainly different in kind, because we don't really have the same categories for number. But I suppose that we do have, in some sense, at least when we consider the previous example between the even and the odd giving way to even, perhaps we would say upon the death of the body of 3, that doesn't mean that the soul of 3 has diminished, because 3 is an eternal form, but it means that what takes place of 3 is going to be a form that is different. In the form of man, the soul is his everlasting component. Now I think that this everlasting component, I've said this many times, perhaps not often so far on the Platonic front, but I have often said it on the Psalm front, that the soul of man and the relationship to the individual can be an unfortunate relationship, I think, especially in the modern day, because our self, our sense of self, and I'll go as far as to say our egos are quite large, comparatively, to those of more traditional societies. Be that as it may, returning to this analogy between the relationship of the body the soul, and the body's finite nature. When the body gives way to death, we see the soul going away. It doesn't mean that it stops existing, just as the 3 doesn't stop existing if it gives way to the 2 and to the even. Its form is not destroyed. So too is the soul of man. It is not destroyed. It continues to exist. Perhaps the question is, how does the 3 exist if the object that is in front of us, the bond, the character, is now 2? In the mind of man, 3 can exist in the material world just as easily as 2 can exist, regardless of what is actually in front of us. And I say actually, perhaps what I should say is what is in front of us materially. Now we can purely represent it abstractly as well. And in that realm, I think it's much more fluid. It sort of makes much more sense when we get into when we cross the boundary into our perceivable reality. All of a sudden, these examples take on a different characteristic. It's as if the transfiguration or the transjective, the process of looking through the subject into the objective, even saying it in these terms doesn't seem quite right, because I was going to say that this filter seems to split our realities, because we cannot see the forms completely. If I have 2 pens in front of me, I group them together. I would not say that I have one, but I can think of what the one would be, the form of one would be. I can easily make the form into one by removing one. But I suppose that one could make the argument that by taking away one, now there is no longer 2. That 2 does not exist until it is brought back into existence. But this does not make sense to say it in terms of existence. It makes sense in terms of going away, because it is not destroyed. For if the form of 2 was completely destroyed, we could never make 2 again. So it must persist. But again, this problem of going away has all sorts of material connotations to it. Like we push it to the side. It is some object that we can feel, that we can touch in our reality, but in fact it is not. It is a constant of nature. It's something that exists within nature. It exists within our universe. It is a law by which we operate within. We operate under the laws of nature. Now, there's a few things I would like to discuss here to further this conversation. Eventually, this dialogue gets into the nature of the earth, sort of its physical structure, its position in the observable realm. And I'd like to talk about Socrates' opinions on the matter, how they differ from our understanding through observation today. And although there are differences, what can we say about it? But before we do that, I think it's prudent to comment on further discussions of the soul. So we have this idea of the soul. Now, from the Psalms, I have come to this idea that the soul is the seat of being for the human being. And from this Platonic philosophy, we have an idea that the soul is immortal. That's not to say that the Jewish or the Christian idea is not that, but rather what we have learned so far, the ideas we've been exploring, is that this seat of being is immortal. And so the questions become, so if we have this thing, this immortal thing that we call the soul, it's at least in part the thing by which we see through the thing that is embodied. The thing that allows us to make sense of the things around us, to interpret the information in such a way about the environment that we find ourselves in, incorporate that information into a conscious mind, a mind that differs between man and animal. There's a sense of elevation here in terms of the divine, that man can illuminate his surroundings, improve his material condition, examine things of a finer nature for finer purposes. And so this soul is the very thing that we use as a label to describe the capability of the human being and the conscious mind of the human being to make sense of its reality. And not only to make sense of its reality, but also to be in harmony with that reality. And to be in harmony with that reality is to be closer to it. And so to be closer to it is to look through a lens that is clear enough so that you can actually see true reality. Now, in the Platonic sense, we do this through the good, through the behavior of the good, through virtuous conduct. And the things that cloud this view would be evil. It would be the deceptions of the body. It could potentially be the heart. Now, Plato maintains that the soul undergoes changes when it is fixed to a body, when it is embodied in a man. And in order to prevent negative consequences, I guess we could say, to the soul, in order for the soul to continue to exist beyond this life and have a good life beyond this life, I guess we could say, it's a strange thing to say that because the life in that sense is not the same, but not to be restrained in any way, it must live for the good. For if it does not live for the good, they posit that the soul will be fixed, it'll be bound to more material longings. Now, I have an idea of this that we will get to in a little while, but we have to remember that the point here is to explore to the fullest of our extent what they thought. What they thought about the nature of the soul, the nature of their reality. And And so I find myself often asking the question, what does it mean for the soul to move into the next life? And how is this information retained? Right? If it's immortal and if it moves into the next life, what does that look like? And then how does it reintegrate itself back into this life, back into the embodied form? And so we have a number of different relationships here in terms of the Platonic forms. We have our classic opposite, the life and death, and the process of becoming that is between them. But in life, we have a relationship between the soul and the body. The body has a relationship to death and the material. The soul has a relationship to the immortal, in which the body does not share, which the material does not share, which death does not share. And so life is this interesting unification of different forms, but it is inherently limited, right? Life itself, in the embodied sense, has a physical component. This physical component does not have the blessing of immortality. And I think because of this, there is an inherent limitation on the elevation of the human being. And I say that because, unless there is some way that the human mind can elevate itself into something that's immortal, that would be a different conversation. An interesting conversation, perhaps, especially given the recent advances in artificial intelligence. But in any case, as it is, the human being in his experience today and throughout all time has been one of this exact relationship. That is, it has an immortal component to it. The conscious mind in general, has the capability of seeing into the future, or planning into the future, not seeing the exact events, seeing the consequences of the past. You can take in information at the present. You can use all this information for specific and directed aims. I would like to reiterate that men may be unified in life, but remains inherently separate because of the experience of the decay and the erosion of the body. But it is the conscious mind that is the thing that interprets our reality. And that this reality remains whether mind remains or not. And the fact of the matter is that if mind in this form is to be as it is, and can question things as they are, as they truly are, then we imagine that in this reality, at least we know it is possible, that such a thing, of such a nature, can exist. And if such a thing and of such a nature can exist in this form, where does the pure form of this come from? Is it the case that the mind of man, the conscious explosion that led to man's ascension on this planet, on Earth, was from something more pure than the consciousness that is embodied, the consciousness that is embodied, let's say. Now, in the Platonic sense, I think that this is very likely that they believe that this is. And I think that this is part of the reason why Socrates finds himself about to be put to death. And this is also why we are discussing why Socrates has made his decision. Right? This is why we're even talking about the immortality of the soul, why he should accept the, albeit possibly in the opinion of Socrates, and well, maybe not the opinion of Socrates, but within the air, within the collective understanding of the environment, perhaps the verdict of death for Socrates was probably not the just one. But that being said, just because it's not necessarily just, he has a particular duty to his society, his state, for what they have given him. But there's also this discussion of the possibility of escaping this because of the unjust nature of the verdict. And so it happens to be that, well, if Socrates is going to be firm in his decision, he has to be firm in the dialogue with his friends about why he is going to be committing himself to this. The question is, well, is this akin to suicide? Is suicide right? Is suicide wrong? All these sorts of questions. There's a lot of questions that bubble up to the surface. But I would say that to return to some sort of continual thread, that at least at this point in the conversation, we are narrowing down not necessarily what the soul is. In a sense, we kind of have done that. Maybe. We've established the immortality of the soul. We have established, to some degree, an existence of the soul, with the things like prior knowledge and this sort of thing. And the idea of the forms, not explicitly stated, but perhaps implied when you think about it enough. There are forms that unify other forms, although there are antagonisms that cannot be brought together, like their opposites. Everything does indeed have an opposite. We have indications of a source of all of this. This unified source. We have a lesser degree of that within the conscious mind of man. Right? This is an observable thing. And if this observable thing is scalable, certainly we can imagine it in higher contexts and lower contexts, ultimately giving us, again, this source from which we can draw. But we are operating within this space now. We are saying of life and of death. Of life we have the soul and the body. Of death we have the body. And loss of the soul. It's not loss of the soul in a certain sense. It's loss of the soul in the material sense. And this is where that argument came in. Well, is the soul truly immortal when the body dies? Now, Plato's conception, or Socrates' conception, is that at the moment of death, when the light of the mind goes out. The soul continues to persist, and that there are divine guides who are assigned to people in life, and upon death, these guides take them to their, let's say, resting place. They take the soul to the resting place. But we can forget about the guides for a moment. They're not all that important. I think there's an important distinction here. There's an important distinction between solid reasoning and this sort of, I don't want to say hypothetical space, because I think that much of what we are engaged in is hypothetical space. It doesn't mean that just because it's within that space it is wrong. There's certainly much reason within it. But there are times when we drift into certain uncharted waters that are not safe for the type of exploration that we are undergoing. And I think the guides is a good example of that. We sort of make this leap in logic and in reason, and we make the assumption that such things exist. Perhaps it's because of a cultural custom, a belief that's common to the Athenians at the time. But we can't let the leaps preclude strong reasoning. And so we should not forget the discussion of the forms. We should not forget the discussion of the opposites. We should not forget the discussion of the nature of the form and how it does not admit its opposite. We should not forget the hierarchy that we will get into soon. But as a matter of soul, I think, regardless of if we choose to add the mythological sugarcoating on top of it, what lies beneath is the substance. The soul being the thing that is the seat of being for man, the mind being the thing that is the thing that provides light to this reality. It includes the person that is experiencing, as well as the other minds that are outside the individual mind that are also experiencing. And due to this specific combination of material structure, it has provided us a conscious view into this reality. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that intelligibility did not exist before. It does not mean that there was no experience before. Certainly there were animals before there were human beings. The human being and the mind of the human being is certainly a unique experience in our local environment, local to the earth. But we understand and we view things as the mind and all intelligibility comes from a source of intelligibility. that it is born from something that knows. And so this something that knows is the source of everything else that knows. And it's this union, this source, unity, that preserves the soul. Now again, it's a rather unfortunate, or perhaps unsatisfying thing to think of the soul returning to a state of union with its divine maker, let's say, the divine mind, returning to it in a strange way, like a piece of a whole returns to it, or rather the piece is aware that it is returned to the whole. And as this piece becomes aware and it's reintegrated, then it undergoes this sort of painful process by which we might call judgment. And there's a lot destroyed within that. And I think that the souls that persist in this environment, in our material reality, are those that are liberated from strict judgment, let's say. Because the souls that are too bodily, in the case of Plato, the souls that have committed crimes, the souls that have gone against the divine order, are the souls that will not persist, in the sense that they will not reunify with the divine mind, because there are too many things in between that have polluted the soul. Now, exactly what that means or how long this process takes, I don't think these are really, at least in the case of the how long does it take, it's not a relevant question. How it takes place is an interesting question, but again, perhaps it's not all that useful to us. The point being is that we have the mind can see, and given that the mind can see and it is open to the experience of the source of all that can see, it is the obligation of the limited source of the human mind to find itself in harmony with the source of the seeing. Again, I think this thought process leads to some relatively unfortunate realities about how much we may carry with us upon the death of the mind. I say us and carry with all this sorts of stuff. I think it's true that intelligibility does not die upon the death of the human being, but in terms of the individual character being preserved, it seems rather unlikely. In any case, let's return to Plato. So we have this idea of the soul, okay? We have the influences of good and of evil. And the soul in life, according to Socrates, maintains changes to it when it's embodied. And as such, it must live as good as possible to maintain goodness after embodiment. Now, exactly what this means and what it means for the reintegration of the human mind into the divine mind once it's over, I'm not sure. What it means for the pattern of the mind that existed to re-emerge into a new form, into a new body. These are difficult things to say. What does it mean for the soul to move into the next life, and how is the information retained? Well, the information is retained because it has some source, it has some divine source. It is the blink of something that is aware of its reality, and then upon its death, that the blink is over. But it is not the only thing that sees, which is, I think, part of the problem. For if it was the only thing that saw, then we would be living in an environment and in a universe, more broadly than the universe, the totality of all existence would be completely meaningless. It would be void of purpose. And it's the essence of faith, for one to say that there is meaning and purpose to existence. And if there is meaning and purpose to existence, that means that there is a divine direction to it, whatever that looks like. And we have to get away from simplistic explanations. But the process of this transmission of intelligibility from the finite into the infinite must occur. The question is how, and I don't know how it does so. But we know that life is this unique thing. Let's take a human life, for example. It connects, on one hand, the immortal, and on the other, the material, or the mortal. The opposites are not directly connected, as we learned before. The opposite cannot admit its opposite and continue to be. It must yield to its opposite. But it doesn't mean that it is destroyed. It doesn't mean that the form is destroyed. It just retreats to a different locale, a different... it's not a different form, but it retreats to a different scenario, a different time of existence, a different representation in reality. I'm not exactly sure how to formulate the language to describe it. But in any case, the body, or I should say life, the human life, it is connected to the body. The body is connected to the soul, which is again the seat of being of man. The seat of being is the thing that connects him to the thing that gives him meaning and purpose. Now the soul, as Plato says, can be corrupted by the body. Because if the seat of being is going to be the thing that provides one with meaning and purpose, if that is to be earthly and material things, then that soul is going to be bound to the earth and to the material. And that soul will encompass many lifetimes and many different individuals. But if it is attached firmly to the immortal or the immaterial, to the source, to the best that it can conceive of, then we will have a variable type of existence, many different unique experiences, many different insights, many different opportunities for growth. And so the body dies in the material sense, but the soul continues. The soul of man continues. That is this thing, this computer within the skull that can perceive, again, that can understand, that can intuit. But the question then becomes, well, if the human mind or the human species is completely destroyed, what does that mean for the soul? Does it still exist? The soul of man would seem to be diminished, for man has ceased to exist. But man, in some sense, has not completely ceased to exist, because man and his mind exists at a particular level of reality. This is something that we will get to shortly. Now, this divine guide, I think that there can be much to unpack, but I think unfortunately, either due to my reading or due to the nature of the explanation, I think it's just not sufficient to really have any reasonable argument about what the role of this divine guide is. Of course, it is to guide, it is to move it to different locations after it has left the body. But again, these are all very human and material type conceptions of leaving and of going to, as if it's not instantaneous. And so we reach an interesting point here, a point of familiarity. If there's anybody that's familiar with John Vervaeke and his work about the propositional, the procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory forms of knowing, it is fairly clear that this dialogue is pointing to at least some of them, if not all of them. Our reality intersects at the mind. The information is sort of filtered into a point. And this information within our mind is then sorted so that we can understand it and that we can perceive of our reality. Limited although it might be, and Plato says we cannot trust the perception and the sensation of the body. Okay. But the fact of the matter is that the mind can, and then the body can, form a representation of its reality. And the mind is intimately linked to the body and the soul. The soul, I think, in large part, includes the mind. So the bit of mind affected by bodily desires, or anything that serves to unjustly corrupt the mind, clouds the window, and the image through this window is less clear. So again, back to what we were talking about, the human mind being this moment in time that can actually see reality. And there is no way to completely remove the individual, perhaps let's say the subject, the thing that is doing the viewing, from the thing that is being viewed, no matter how objective he wants to be. Again, no matter how much he wants to separate the subject and the object. The fact of the matter is that the reality encompasses both of them. And without the mind, there would be no objective frame. And so again, what can we say of the soul and where is it? Well, we say that the soul is the seat of being. The seat of being freed of bodily desires and deception. This is the thing that truly illuminates reality, because it attempts to be and to exist with reality as it is, rather than to satisfy the heart, or to satisfy the parts of the human mind that wish to deceive itself for its own purposes, for its own self-indulgence. So how do we properly transpose the soul onto reality? Well, there are different ways. Moderation, courage, virtue, justice, reason, logic, experience, practices, faith in the transposition and in higher realities. I think that's an important component to it. Now, the relationship between mind and the soul and the unified being, the source of all mind and all soul, let's say, I think the relationship varies based on the degree of overlap or share in the divine nature. So if the soul is mapped completely into the surface area of the unified being, and the mind is committed to maintaining that, then this is the true illumination of reality. That is, it sees reality as it is, and it devotes itself to it. So it uses all tools that are available to it, including the scientific worldview, including the, let's say, the top-down argumentation for the nature of being. But what can be said is the relationship of the mind to the soul is a constant of man. It must be. And the closer the soul moves to the unified being, and the less the mind move the less the mind move towards desires and deception, the greater the understanding of reality will be for the individual. And if they understand reality more fully and greater, they will be in a harmony. They will be in a synergy with the divine entity. They will be at peace. Their existence will have purpose. It will have meaning. They will know that they are loved, and that they truly have a place and a home in this life and in the next. Even if it means that in the next life, that life does not include the selfish desires that we use to pervert our time here in this life. That is the complete surrendering of the self. And I should say the complete surrendering of the self upon death to the divine source. And so now we get into a rather interesting topic, but it can be confusing at times. But this is Socrates' view of the earth. And just like the biblical literature, sometimes it's difficult to separate out when he's talking about material things and when he's talking about more divine, spiritual things. But he says the earth is a sphere that is surrounded by the heavens. The earth, this material substance, it remains unmoved. The heavens are a place above the earth. In the celestial realm, they are associated with the divine and celestial bodies. Now, the celestial bodies had divine significance. Now, what's not true is the literal component here. Because for all they observed back in those days, they thought that when they looked up, perhaps, the celestial bodies were in the divine realm. And they were only seeing a small bit of it. Now, that might not even be completely true, because I think there's half of the, at the minimum, there's half of this argument is wound up in a sophisticated philosophical inclination. It's a sophisticated philosophical intuition about the nature of reality. And I don't think that they are much at fault for material misconceptions, because that's really not the point of a lot of the discussion that takes place here. And so just like in the biblical corpus, the earth is a material thing and the heavens above it occupy the meaningful space. And so Socrates says that water and mist always flow into the hollows of the earth. If we wanted to make a comparison, we can think about the observational theory that the gas and dust, the particles after the Big Bang, they cooled and they stuck together and they formed the planets. The process by which we call accretion. But again, it's not about tick for tack. It's not about the material argument over material argument. The first argument, the Platonic one, the water and mist always flow into the hollows of the earth. This is a meaningful argument. It is trying to give an account for the meaning of things. And so the hollows of the earth are the big philosophical breakthrough here in my mind, because the hollows are the things for which there is no material. We can put a place stopper there because it's not entirely true, but it is a realm within the earth, or we could say it's a realm within material reality that allows for the possibility of life and of a being that is able to intuit and able to perceive of the reality around it, of the material reality around it. And these hollows find themselves at different levels. And so I'll read a note here that I wrote to myself. The hollows are the experience or the local environment that affords an experience of reality. And this experience of reality changes when finding the next level of the hollows. And so here comes the one of the most beautiful things about this dialogue. It is the structure of the hollows, at the bottom of which I think we can say that the base hollow represents nearly nothingness. Socrates gives this analogy of those that live at the bottom of the sea. He says that they say nothing worth mentioning is in the sea. Nothingness is fully developed. Interesting way to conceive of this. And going back to my initial thought, Socrates, he gives an analogy to those that live at the bottom of the sea. They are weighed down by the heaviness of their existence and their surroundings. They are unable to understand what it's like for them to live as the Athenians live, at the edge of the waters. And just like the people at the bottom of the sea that perceive of the Athenians at the top, so too the Athenians perceive of another race above them on the surface of the earth, where their society lives on the shore, and the elevated society lives on the shore, not of the water, but to the divine realm. And in their temples, true gods exist. They truly inhabit their temples. They are embodied. But returning to the hollows, and returning to the intelligibility of these hollows, if we take this analogy, we apply it to the hollows, I think we can understand quite rapidly that the reality, the existence, the perception of the material reality that surrounds them is part of the way in which they form the structure of their experience. And we can think of that materially, I suppose, in terms of the brain chemistry, neurons that fire and that are built in a particular way to allow us to perceive in a particular way. But the more philosophical point is that these levels scale in terms of sophistication from the bare bones nothingness all the way up to the source of it all, the infinity, the source of being, the source of mind. Now, just as in biblical cosmology, here in the Platonic philosophy, we see the convergence between heaven and earth. In between this convergence, we have, as the two spheres contact one another, as we move away from the point of convergence, we have an ever-increasing distance between the two spheres. And again, I think this can also represent a form of the hollows. As you move away, the surface area between the lines gets larger and larger. This has to do with the less unified forms of perception, the less unified understanding of reality. As it gets closer and closer to the point of convergence between heaven and earth, one understands the true nature of reality as it's meant to be, because heaven is the intelligible component. The earth is the material structure of it. It is the, what could we call it? The operating system, perhaps. Maybe we could say it's the hardware that allows for the operating system to actually run on. And then we have Socrates' conception of the nature of things on the surface of the earth and beneath the heavens. And so this section is difficult. Interesting, but difficult. So we have a view of the earth in its spherical form from above. From above, we see its brightness and purity of color. We can see variety through the hollows. But within the structure of the hollows, this convergence between the two convex surfaces, right, that bump up against one another. You have two spherical objects, you place them together so that they're in contact. There's one point of contact between them. In the hollows, at the various levels of that reality, you have the levels of between let's say, different views, different perceptions of reality. Again, as you ascend the ladder of the levels, that perception begins to become more and more clear until you reach the actual source, and that's absolute clarity at that point. But the point that I'm trying to make is that at each of these levels, you have a point of convergence between the concave surfaces, between heaven and earth. And at each point, we can imagine the human being occupying one level, perhaps more than one level, depending on his development and his growth, I think we can achieve higher levels if we continue to grow in wisdom. Of course, there's a certain point we can't sort of merge with the divine because we are human by nature. But as we ascend these levels, we ascend in purity because we approach the divine. And so then we have a few questions. What is the earth? Surely it must be a symbol of material reality. And what is the hollow? Which we've already sort of answered. Again, the hollows are within the earth. The hollows are within material reality. The more elevated, the closer they are to true reality or pure reality. Now, the difficult thing to follow is the explanation of all the various waters and the rivers that flow into the earth. And Socrates says these things, they interconnect and they intertwine, they move into a large body of water called Tartarus in the middle of the earth. And it's somewhat difficult to follow because it's no longer all that unitary. It sort of devolves into this structure. The hollows of intelligibility are numerous and interconnected, he says, and they flow into one another in deep chasms. He uses the metaphor for breathing to convey the regular pattern of going in and going out of this flow. Now, each stream of intelligibility is affected by the environment that it flows through, which I suppose is a similar pattern to what we mentioned about one singular hollow, but in this case it's the hollows that are stacked upon each other. And in this way, the soul is led by its guardian spirit, is sort of led through the hollow, if you will. And he's led to a certain point where he is judged. He reaches a point at perhaps a new level of existence. And this judgment determines if the soul is able to continue on its journey through these hollows. Its judgment, the penalty for misdeeds in life, it seems to be a combination of two variables. One is time, but time that is dependent not on its own nature, but on the reconciliation between the parties involved, between the offender and the victim. And once that moral dilemma is solved, then it is possible for the soul to return or to continue on its journey through this sort of chasm, this interwoven mess of hollows and rivers. Now it's funny because at the end of this, Socrates says, now he says this at the end of the talk about the interconnectedness of the hollows and the structure of the depths of the earth. He says, quote, "No sensible man would insist these things are as I describe," which is sort of a funny thing to put at the end because he is saying that I've taken some liberties here. But even though he has taken some liberties, I think there is a lot of truth in some of the earlier discussions. And we have already mentioned what some of those are. But the most recent of which, I think, are the levels of intelligibility and of reality, and how they scale back to a single source. And so essentially this dialogue ends there with that thought. And then there is the narrative component that comes back in. Socrates is discussing with his friends. He drinks the hemlock. The hemlock begins to affect him from distal to more proximal. His legs begin to go cold. His organs begin to go cold. His friends are weeping. He says his final words. And that's it. He passes away. And there's this sort of solemn, this melancholy that is within the end of the dialogue. And it is a sad ending, for sure. Because, in some sense, we have made progress in understanding. But we witnessed a man that died, I think, falsely accused. But in his death, he was liberated, for he knew that he was innocent, and his legacy would carry on after him. Now, in the material sense, I think we can try to delude ourselves into thinking that his soul sort of continues through his friends and his offspring. And perhaps they do, to a certain degree, but I would not say that this is his soul. This is his spirit. His spirit comes from his soul. And if his spirit remains on the earth after he has perished, then I think what we can say of his spirit that remains is that it is a good force. And certainly his spirit continues to this day. And it's quite a profound thing to have such an impact. And so with that, I'll end it there. Next time we will continue with Cratylus, another Platonic dialogue.